Eris, a fairy from the Dawn Court, with golden wings and a fiery spirit. Nyx, a fairy from the Dusk Court, with midnight-colored wings and a mysterious aura.
Chapter 1: The Forbidden Glance. The Dawn Court sky burned gold as Eris soared above the mist-laden treetops. Below, rivers shimmered like molten sunlight, and flowers stretched toward the heavens, eager for the day's first kiss. She was the fastest flyer among her kin, a warrior trained to protect the light from the creeping shadows of dusk. Yet, one evening, as she flew past the borders forbidden to her kind, she saw something, or rather someone, who made her wings falter. Across the river, bathed in the eerie glow of twilight, stood a fairy with wings like the deep night sky, shimmering with silver specks. Her dark eyes held secrets that made Eris's chest tighten. Nyx. A name whispered like a warning in the Dawn Court. A warrior of the Dusk Court, the enemy. For a moment they locked eyes, the golden glow of dusk painting their faces in shades of longing and danger. It was only a second. But sometimes, a second is all it takes for fate to change forever. Chapter 2: A Spark in the Shadows. Eris knew she should have looked away. The laws of the Dawn Court were clear. No fairy was to cross into the lands of dusk. But something in Nyx's gaze held her captive. It was not hostility, nor the cold indifference she expected from an enemy. It was curiosity. Nyx took a step forward, her midnight wings fluttering with caution. Eris's breath hitched. She knew she should leave, return to the safety of golden light. Yet her feet remained planted, the river between them feeling like an invisible tether rather than a barrier's. "You shouldn't be here," Nyx finally spoke, her voice like the hush of nightfall. Eris's pulse raced. "Neither should you." Nyx tilted her head. "I belong here." "You do not." Eris bristled, but she could hear the amusement in Nyx's tone. It was not a threat, not a warning, just a simple truth. A rustling in the trees shattered the moment. Eris knew it could be a patrol from her court. If she was caught even looking at a dusk fairy, there would be consequences. Without another word, she turned and took flight, feeling the weight of Nyx's gaze on her back. As she disappeared into the golden sky, one thought consumed her. She wanted to see Nyx again. Chapter 3: The Pull of the Forbidden. Eris couldn't shake the memory of Nyx. The way the dusk fairy had looked at her. Steady, unreadable, and yet intrigued. It haunted her, even in the warmth of the sun. She should forget. She should pretend the moment never happened. But the more she tried, the stronger the pull became.
Days passed, yet Ares found herself lingering near the border. Just for a moment, she told herself, just to see if Nyx would return. And one evening, as the sky bled into twilight, she did. Nyx stood at the river's edge, her midnight wings catching the last rays of light. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched Ares with the same quiet intensity as before. Ares's heart pounded. She knew the rules, knew the risk, but something in her rebelled. With a steady breath, she crossed the river. Chapter 4: Crossing the line. Ares barely noticed the cool water lapping at her ankles as she stepped across the river, the boundary that no Dawn Court fairy should ever breach. But in that moment, all she saw was Nyx, waiting on the other side, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Nyx arched a brow. "Brave, aren't you?" Ares swallowed hard. "Curious." Nyx smirked. "Curiosity can be dangerous." Ares glanced back at the golden sky behind her. She knew she should return before anyone noticed her absence. But standing here, so close to Nyx, she felt something she had never known before. A thrill, a longing, an understanding that shouldn't exist between two fairies from rival courts. "Then tell me," Ares said, her voice steady, "why are you here?" Nyx hesitated, her expression flickering with something unreadable. Then, she took a step closer, so close that Ares could see the silver specks in her midnight wings. "Maybe," Nyx whispered, "I'm curious too." Ares's breath caught. The line between them had been drawn long ago, a law older than both of them. And yet, in this quiet, stolen moment, that line blurred into nothing. Chapter 5: A dangerous game. Aries knew she should leave. The longer she lingered, the greater the risk. But as Nyx stood before her, close enough that Aries could feel the faint hum of her magic in the air, she found herself unable to move. "You're playing a dangerous game," Nyx murmured, eyes flickering with something Aries couldn't quite name. "So are you," Aries countered, tilting her chin up. Nyx studied her for a long moment before a slow, knowing smile curved her lips. "Then I suppose we're both reckless." The weight of their choices settled between them. Dawn and dusk were never meant to mix. Their courts tolerated each other, but only just. If they were caught together, the consequences would be severe. But despite the warnings that echoed in Aries' mind, she couldn't bring herself to turn away. "Meet me again," she said before she could stop herself. Nyx's wings twitched. "When?" Aries felt her pulse quicken. "Tomorrow. Same time." For a moment, Nyx seemed to consider. Then, with a small nod, she stepped back, her silhouette blending into the darkening sky. Aries watched her disappear, her heart racing. She had crossed a line tonight, and tomorrow, she would cross it again. Chapter 6, Secrets in the Twilight. The next evening, Aries was already at the river before the sun began to set. She told herself she wasn't nervous, but the way her hands clenched at her sides said otherwise.
Would Nyx come? As the last streaks of gold faded into violet, a familiar shadow appeared across the water. Nyx stepped into view, her midnight wings catching the dim light like shattered stardust. "You're early," Nyx remarked, amusement lacing her voice. Aries crossed her arms. "So are you." Nyx smirked but said nothing. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze studying Aries as if trying to solve a riddle. "Why did you really come?" Aries asked, shifting on her feet. Nyx tilted her head. "You asked me to." "That's not an answer." Nyx's expression softened, just slightly. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd actually show up." Aries swallowed. "And?" Nyx took another step forward, their wings almost brushing. "And now I know." Aries felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but before she could reply, a distant sound made them both freeze, voices, carried on the wind. Someone was coming. Nyx's expression hardened. "Go. Now." Aries hesitated, but Nyx's eyes darkened. "If they find you here, it won't end well." Reluctantly, Aries turned and took flight, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she soared back toward the safety of her court, she risked one last glance over her shoulder. Nyx was still standing there, watching her go. And Aries knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 7. A risk worth taking. Aries spent the night restless, her thoughts tangled with images of Nyx. The way her voice had dipped into something almost soft. The way her eyes had lingered just a little too long. The way she had warned Aries to leave, not as an enemy, but as someone who cared. The next day, Aries tried to focus on her duties. She trained with her fellow warriors, patrolled the golden fields of the Dawn Court, and listened to the whispers of the elders. But her mind kept drifting back to the river, to the forbidden meeting, to the undeniable pull toward the dusk ferry. By the time the sun dipped low again, her decision was already made. She would return. When Aries arrived at the river, Nyx was already there, standing half in the shadows, her arms crossed. "You're persistent," Nyx said, arching a brow. Aries smirked. "And you keep showing up, so what does that say about you?" Nyx huffed a quiet laugh. "That I enjoy breaking rules, apparently." Aries stepped closer, feeling the tension crackling between them like a storm about to break. "Why did you tell me to leave last night?" Nyx's amusement faded, replaced by something more serious. "Because if the Dusk Court found you, they wouldn't have let you go." Aries' chest tightened. "Then why take the risk?" Nyx studied her for a long moment before replying, her voice quieter this time. "Because you're a risk worth taking." Aries' breath hitched. For a moment, the world around them faded, no rival courts, no rules, just the quiet truth hanging between them. She knew, in that instant, that there was no turning back. And she didn't want to. Chapter 8. A Dance with Fate. Aries wasn't sure who moved first. One moment, she and Nyx were standing on opposite sides of the river, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. The next, they were inches apart, wings fluttering in the evening breeze, their magic humming in the air like an unsung melody. Nyx's gaze dropped to Aries' lips, just for a heartbeat, before flicking back up. "This is dangerous," she murmured. Aries' pulse raced. "Then why does it feel like we're meant to be here?" Nyx exhaled softly, as if she'd been holding something back for far too long. because some things are worth the risk. For the first time in her life, Aries understood what it meant to be truly reckless. She had spent years following the rules, believing in the divide between their courts. But standing here, inches from Nyx, she no longer cared about the laws of the dawn and dusk. She cared about this moment. About her. A distant sound shattered the fragile stillness. Voices, close, too close. Nyx stiffened, her expression turning sharp. Go. Now. Aries hesitated. I can't keep running. Nyx's eyes darkened. Then don't get caught. Before Aries could reply, Nyx reached out and pressed something into her palm, a small, black feather, soft to shadow. Meet me tomorrow, Nyx whispered. Same place. Then she turned, disappearing into the night just as figures emerged from the trees. Aries clenched the feather tightly in her hand, her heart hammering. She had crossed the line once again, and she knew, without a doubt, that she would do it again. Chapter 9. A feather in the light. Aries spent the entire night staring at the black feather in her palm. It was small, delicate, yet it carried a weight she couldn't explain. A piece of Nyx, a silent promise. She shouldn't have taken it. If anyone in the Dawn Court found it, there would be questions she wasn't ready to answer. At sunrise, she tucked it beneath her armor, close to her heart. All day, she moved through her duties in a daze. The golden fields of the Dawn Court felt dull, the sun too bright, the warmth suffocating. It wasn't enough anymore. She wanted the cool touch of dusk, the whisper of shadows, the thrill of forbidden glances. She wanted Nyx. As twilight descended, Aries was already at the river. This time, she didn't hesitate. She crossed the water with steady steps, her wings shimmering in the fading light. Nyx was there, waiting, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. You came. Aries smirked. Did you think I wouldn't? Nyx studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. No, I knew you would. Something in her voice sent shivers down Aries' spine. They stood there, a breath apart, the air between them charged with something neither of them dared name. Then, without thinking, Aries reached out and brushed her fingers against Nyx's. It was barely a touch. A whisper of skin against skin, but it felt like setting fire to the sky. Nyx inhaled sharply, her wings twitching. But she didn't pull away. Aries' heart pounded. Tell me this isn't real, she whispered. Tell me to leave. Nyx's fingers tightened around hers. I won't. And just like that, the last of Aries' hesitation burned away. There was no turning back now. Chapter 10. Caught in the glow. Aries barely breathed. Nyx's fingers were still wrapped around hers, the warmth of her touch sending sparks up Aries' spine. The night air hummed between them, thick with unspoken words and dangerous longing. Nyx exhaled slowly. This is madness. Aries' grip tightened. Then let's be mad together. A small, rueful smile played on Nyx's lips, but her eyes were dark, uncertain. You don't understand what will happen if we're caught. Aries knew the risks. The Dawn Court would call her a traitor. The Dusk Court might never let Nyx go unpunished. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the way Nyx was looking at her, like Aries was something forbidden and beautiful all at once. I don't care, Aries whispered. Nyx's wings fluttered, and for a moment, it looked like she might pull away. But then, something in her shattered. She closed the distance between them in a single breath. Aries barely had time to react before Nyx's lips were on hers, soft but urgent, hesitant but hungry. It was like the first touch of dusk meeting dawn, two opposites colliding in a burst of light. Aries melted into it, her hands slipping up Nyx's arms, feeling the shift of muscle beneath her fingertips. Nyx kissed like she fought, with precision, with passion, like she was trying to memorize every moment before it was stolen away. And then, a sound. A branch snapping. They broke apart, both turning sharply toward the darkness beyond the trees. Voices. Nyx swore under her breath. Go. Now. Aries hesitated. Not without you. Nyx's expression hardened. I'll find you tomorrow. Just go. Aries wanted to argue, wanted to stay, but the voices were getting closer. With one last lingering look, she turned and took flight, vanishing into the golden sky. As she soared toward home, her lips still tingling from Nyx's kiss, she knew one thing for certain. She would risk everything to see her again. Chapter 11. Shadows on their heels. Aries didn't land immediately when she reached the Dawn Court. Instead, she lingered in the sky, her heart still pounding from the stolen kiss, from the thrill of touching Nyx, from the danger that had nearly caught them. She could still feel the ghost of Nyx's lips against hers. But her moment of bliss shattered as she spotted a group of warriors gathered below. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their golden armor glinting beneath the moonlight. She landed silently nearby, just close enough to hear. There were whispers of a trespasser near the border, one of the warriors said, his brow furrowed. The Dusk Court is growing bold. Ares forced her expression to remain neutral, even as panic clawed at her throat. Another warrior scoffed. If they dare cross into our lands, we'll make them regret it. Ares clenched her fists. She knew what they were thinking. They saw the Dusk Court as nothing more than shadows to be crushed beneath their golden light. They didn't know Nyx. If they ever found out what Ares had done, what she was still doing, it wouldn't just be Nyx who paid the price. She had to be careful. The next evening, Ares made her way back to the river, but this time, she moved cautiously, her senses sharpened. If her court was on high alert, then the Dusk Court might be as well. She reached the riverbank just as the last traces of sunlight vanished, her pulse quickening as she searched the shadows for Nyx. Then, movement. Nyx stepped forward, but something about her posture was different tonight. Tense. Watchful. They're looking for us, Nyx murmured before Ares could even speak. Both courts. They know someone was at the border. Ares swallowed. Do they know it was us? Not yet. Nyx's expression was unreadable, but it won't take them long to figure it out. Ares's heart pounded. Then what do we do? Nyx studied her, the silver glow of her eyes softening just a fraction. We have two choices. We stop this now, or we get better at hiding. Ares didn't hesitate. I'm not stopping. Something flickered across Nyx's face, relief, maybe even something deeper, but it was gone before Ares could grasp it. Then we need to be careful. Nyx reached out, brushing her fingers against Ares's wrist. Just for a second. Just enough to set Ares's skin on fire. I promise. They would find a way. Even if the whole world hunted them down. Chapter 12. A silent war. The next few days were a test of Ares's willpower. The Dawn Court was restless. Patrols doubled along the border, warriors spoke in hushed voices about possible spies, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The Dusk Court had not made a move yet, but everyone sensed it. A storm was brewing. Ares forced herself to act normal. She trained harder, kept her head down, and pretended she wasn't sneaking away every night to meet Nyx. But the stolen moments at the river were becoming more dangerous. They spoke in whispers, touched only in fleeting, desperate gestures. Every meeting carried the weight of knowing it could be their last. I don't like this, Nyx muttered one night, her eyes flicking to the treetops as if expecting to see golden-winged warriors lurking there. They're hunting for us. Ares exhaled. Then we stay one step ahead. Nyx gave her a look, part admiration, part frustration. You're reckless. Ares smirked. And you like it? Nyx huffed, shaking her head, but there was no denying the way her fingers brushed Ares's as they stood close, their wings nearly touching. Then, a rustle. A distant sound. Nyx stiffened, her entire body going rigid. Ares didn't hesitate. She grabbed Nyx's hand and pulled her into the shadows of the trees just as a patrol of Dawn Court warriors passed nearby. Ares held her breath, her back pressed against the rough bark of a tree, Nyx so close she could feel the rise and fall of her chest. If they were caught now, there would be no explaining this away. The warriors lingered for a moment before moving on. When the danger passed, Ares let out a shaky breath. But before she could step away, Nyx's fingers curled around her wrist. Their eyes met in the dim light, something raw and electric sparking between them. Then Nyx moved. Her lips were on Ares's in an instant, the kiss deeper than their first, more desperate, more claiming. Like they were running out of time. Like they didn't care about anything except this, each other. Ares melted into it, her hands gripping Nyx's waist, pulling her closer. But then another sound. Closer this time. They broke apart, their breathing uneven. We can't keep doing this, Nyx whispered, her voice rough. Ares knew what she meant, but she also knew the truth. We can't stop either. Nyx stared at her, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, meet me tomorrow. But not here. It's not safe anymore. Ares nodded. Where? Nyx hesitated before murmuring, the ruins. Just before midnight. Then she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aries standing there, breathless. She knew this was spiraling out of control. She also knew she didn't care. Chapter 13. The ruins at midnight. Aries had never gone so far into the borderlands before. The ruins lay deep in the untamed land between the dawn and dusk courts, a place neither kingdom claimed, a place filled with crumbling stone and tangled ivy, long abandoned by all but ghosts and whispers. It was the perfect hiding place. She landed lightly on the mossy ground, her wings folding against her back as she scanned the shadows. The air smelled of rain and old magic, the kind that made her skin prickle. Then, movement. Nyx emerged from the darkness, her midnight wings barely making a sound as she landed beside Aries. Even in the dim moonlight, she was breathtaking. "You came," Nyx murmured. Aries smirked. "Of course. Did you think I wouldn't?" Nyx huffed a quiet laugh. "No, I knew you would." The words sent a strange warmth through Aries's chest. But there was no time for teasing. They both knew why they were here. "We need to be smarter," Nyx said, folding her arms. "The Dawn Court is watching the border. The Dusk Court is growing suspicious too." Aries nodded. "Then we meet here instead." Nyx hesitated. "Aries." There was something different in her voice this time. Not hesitation. Not fear. Something deeper. Aries stepped closer. "What is it?" Nyx exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I never meant for this to happen." Aries's heart pounded. "For what to happen?" Nyx looked at her then, really looked at her. "For you to mean this much." Nyx stared at her, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Meet me tomorrow. But not here. It's not safe anymore." Aries nodded. "Where?" Nyx hesitated before murmuring, "The ruins. Just before midnight." Then she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aries standing there, breathless. She knew this was spiraling out of control. She also knew she didn't care. Chapter 13. The ruins at midnight. Aries had never gone so far into the borderlands before. The ruins lay deep in the untamed land between the dawn and dusk courts, a place neither kingdom claimed, a place filled with crumbling stone and tangled ivy, long abandoned by all but ghosts and whispers. It was the perfect hiding place. She landed lightly on the mossy ground, her wings folding against her back as she scanned the shadows. The air smelled of rain and old magic, the kind that made her skin prickle. Then, movement. Nyx emerged from the darkness, her midnight wings barely making a sound as she landed beside Aries. Even in the dim moonlight, she was breathtaking. "You came," Nyx murmured. Aries smirked. "Of course. Did you think I wouldn't?" Nyx huffed a quiet laugh. "No, I knew you would." The words sent a strange warmth through Aries's chest. But there was no time for teasing. They both knew why they were here. "We need to be smarter," Nyx said, folding her arms. "The Dawn Court is watching the border. The Dusk Court is growing suspicious too." Aries nodded. "Then we meet here instead." Nyx hesitated. "Aries." There was something different in her voice this time. Not hesitation. Not fear. Something deeper. Aries stepped closer. "What is it?" Nyx exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I never meant for this to happen." Aries's heart pounded. "For what to happen?" Nyx looked at her then, really looked at her. "For you to mean this much." The world stilled. Aries didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was Nyx. Maybe it was fate itself, pulling them together. But the next thing she knew, Nyx's hands were on her waist, her breath warm against Aries's lips. And then she was kissing her, slow this time, careful, like she was memorizing every moment. Aries melted into it, wrapping her arms around Nyx's shoulders, pulling her closer, deeper, as if she could keep this moment forever. She wished she could. But nothing this perfect could last. Because just as Nyx whispered her name, just as Aries felt like she might never breathe without her again, a sharp sound cut through the air. A warning horn. Aries froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. The Dawn Court's alarm. They'd been found. Chapter 14. The knife in the dark. Aries's blood ran cold. The Dawn Court's warning horn echoed through the ruins, its sharp wail sending panic through her veins. She turned to Nyx, expecting urgency, fear, some sign that they needed to run. But Nyx wasn't moving. She stood frozen, her expression unreadable, her midnight eyes shadowed with something Aries couldn't quite name. And then, Aries heard it. The rustle of wings. The quiet shuffle of footsteps. She spun just as figures emerged from the ruins, warriors, their silver-lined armor glinting in the moonlight. Not Dawn Court warriors. Dusk Court warriors. Her heart clenched. Nyx? Nyx's jaw tightened. Ares of the Dawn Court, a cold voice said. A tall figure stepped forward, his dark robes flowing like liquid night. Commander Vareth, one of the Dusk Court's highest-ranking generals. Nyx's general. Ares staggered back, her pulse pounding. What is this? Nyx didn't answer. Commander Vareth's lips curled in a cruel smirk. Did you really think you could sneak into our lands without consequence? He tilted his head. Did you think our little Nyx would keep your secrets forever? Ares's breath caught. No, this couldn't be happening. She turned to Nyx, searching for an explanation, for some kind of denial. Tell me this isn't real. But Nyx just stared at her, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had known. She had led her here. Ares felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her. Her chest ached, as if someone had reached inside her and torn something vital from her ribs. You used me, she whispered. Nyx flinched. Ares, but before she could finish, Commander Vareth lifted a hand, and two warriors stepped forward, iron cuffs glinting in their hands. Seize her. Ares's body reacted before her mind could. She moved fast, twisting away, wings flaring as she darted into the air. But she wasn't fast enough. Pain exploded in her side as something sharp sliced across her ribs, a dagger, thrown with perfect precision. She gasped, her flight faltering, her vision blurring as she crashed to the ground. Distantly, she heard Nyx yell something, her voice sharp with something that almost sounded like panic. But Ares didn't care anymore. She had trusted Nyx, and Nyx had betrayed her. Darkness swallowed her whole. Chapter 15. Shackles and lies. Ares awoke to the cold bite of iron around her wrists. Her body ached, her side burned where the dagger had struck, and the air was thick with dampness and stone. She was in a cell, a deep one, hidden away in the Dusk Court's stronghold. Her wings twitched, but the moment she moved, pain lanced through her body. She wasn't just restrained, she was weakened. Iron. They had used iron shackles. She clenched her teeth against the rage rising inside her. And then, footsteps. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and light spilled into the chamber. Ares forced herself to sit up, ignoring the throbbing in her side. Nyx stepped inside. Ares went still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nyx's face was unreadable, but her eyes, gods, her eyes were storm-tossed. You should have left when I told you to, Nyx said quietly. Ares let out a hollow laugh. Oh, so that's how we're playing this? Like you didn't lure me here? Nyx's jaw tightened. I didn't have a choice. Ares's blood boiled. There's always a choice. Nyx flinched at that, just barely, but Ares caught it. Good. Let her feel the weight of this. Did you ever mean any of it? Ares demanded, her voice sharper now, angrier. The river? The stolen moments? The kiss? Nyx sucked in a breath. You think it was all a lie? Ares bared her teeth. Wasn't it? Nyx stepped closer then, lowering her voice as if someone might be listening. You don't understand. Ares let out a bitter laugh. Then explain it to me, Nyx. Explain why you led me into a trap. Explain why I'm in chains while you stand there free. Nyx hesitated. And for the first time since Ares had met her, she looked lost. I was given a command, Nyx finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Find out why the Dawn Court was crossing the border. Lure them in. Capture them. She swallowed hard. I didn't expect it to be you. Ares's chest ached. And yet, you still did it. Nyx exhaled sharply, looking away. I tried to stop it. Ares shook her head. Not hard enough. Silence stretched between them. Then, Nyx stepped closer, too close. Her fingers barely brushed Ares's wrist, like she wanted to do more, but couldn't. I didn't want this, Nyx murmured. Ares ripped her hands away, her voice shaking with fury. You don't get to say that. Nyx's expression cracked for a split second. Guilt, regret, something deeper. But then, as quick.